All right, so we're going to jump into something pretty interesting today.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to find this one particularly thought-provoking.
Definitely.
We're looking at a YouTube commentary, and it's a reaction to some really, really provocative ideas. Basically, the claim that marriage, the way we typically understand it, actually promotes white supremacy.
Yeah, it's right away what's interesting is that this is coming from like an academic source. So the YouTuber who we're going to be looking at goes by the name Aquarius Wave.
Okay.
And they're basically reacting to this article that was published in the Journal of Marriage and Family by a Professor Bethany Letiak.
Got it.
At George Mason University.
Okay.
And so it's really the argument that's presented in this article that becomes kind of the central point of the whole discussion.
So this Professor Letiak, what is she actually arguing?
Right. So the core of her argument, at least as it's presented, through this YouTube commentary, revolves around something she calls marriage fundamentalism. Oh. Now, this isn't just like people who value marriage. It's more about the belief that the traditional two-parent married family structure is inherently superior to any other family form.
Okay.
And then the really challenging part is that this belief system, according to the article, ends up supporting white heteropatriarchal supremacy.
Whoa. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Let's break that term down a little bit, because I think that's really the crux of this whole discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, when we're talking about heteropatriarchal, obviously hetero refers to heterosexual relationships.
Right.
Patriarchy is referring to that kind of system where men hold most of the power.
Yeah.
And supremacy in this context means believing one group is just better than us.
Okay.
And specifically tied to whiteness.
Gotcha.
So the argument is that this idealization of the traditional married family, it reinforces a hierarchy that puts white heterosexual men right at the top.
So it's important to look at, where this professor's coming from, what's her background, what informs her perspective.
Absolutely. And the YouTuber actually brings this up too. Yeah.
Bethany Letiak is an associate professor in the College of Education and Human Development at George Mason University.
Okay.
And her expertise is in things like community-based participatory action research and, crucially, anti-racist research methods.
Okay.
So she's really coming at this whole issue with a lens that's focused on understanding and dismantling structural inequalities.
Right.
So for our listeners, the question becomes, how does someone with this kind of background draw a connection between something like marriage and white supremacy?
Yeah, it's a pretty big leap.
Definitely.
So what was the YouTuber's initial reaction to this?
Well, to put it lightly, I think it was strong disbelief.
Okay.
The YouTuber even talks about rolling their eyes at the very suggestion.
Oh, wow.
And the immediate counter argument is that this whole thing is basically propaganda.
Okay.
And the big concern there is that it's meant to discourage women, especially Black women, from getting married and having kids.
So they're seeing this as potentially harmful to the Black community. Yeah. And what's striking is the link the YouTuber makes to real-world issues within the Black community.
Right.
Things like higher rates of single-parent households and abortion.
And this YouTuber is saying that this article might actually make those things worse.
Right. It's like framing the professor's argument as potentially damaging. It's undermining what are seen as essential foundations for strong families.
Right.
So this is where you start to see how these academic theories, when they collide with real life experiences, it can create some really strong reactions.
Yeah, absolutely. So the YouTuber is obviously very skeptical.
Oh, yeah.
They're questioning the timing of this article. Why is this coming out now? And what's the motivation behind it, particularly since it's coming from a white woman?
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that the YouTuber feels like there's some kind of agenda at play here.
It gets personal. The YouTuber kind of speculates that maybe Professor Letiak had some bad experiences, in her own relationships, and that's why she's making this argument.
Right. And even though, that kind of personal speculation isn't really engaging with the academic argument itself,
right,
it does show you how people try to make sense of things. They look at someone's personal life to understand their motivations, especially when they're saying something that challenges your beliefs.
Right. It's like, well, why is she saying this? What's her deal?
Exactly.
And it gets even more complicated when the YouTuber reveals some more about Professor Letiak.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
So the professor in her article, she's open about the fact that she's a white cisgender woman. She's in a committed heterosexual relationship.
Okay.
And co-raising a child with her partner, but they're not married.
Oh, wow.
And the YouTuber really emphasizes this.
Yeah.
Pointing out what they see as a huge contradiction.
Right. So the question becomes, how can you be part of the very system that you're criticizing?
Right. And that's what fuels so much of the skepticism and dismissal, in the commentary.
It's like she's saying marriage is bad for society, but she's living that life.
It really makes you think about the different ways people can be part of a system and still be critical of it, you know?
Yeah, it's complicated.
For sure.
So to understand where she's coming from, we need to look at the bigger picture. What are the theoretical frameworks that she's probably using to make this argument?
Right. So the YouTube video mentions a couple of key frameworks, critical feminism and intersectionality.
And for our listeners who might not be familiar with those terms, can you break those down a little bit?
Yeah, so critical feminism, you can think of it as a way of looking at society that questions, those traditional gender roles and power dynamics. It basically says that a lot of our social structures historically have favored men. And then intersectionality adds another layer to that. It argues that all these different forms of inequality, like race, gender, class, sexual orientation, they don't exist separately. They all intersect and create these unique and often overlapping experiences of oppression. So it's likely that Professor Lediak is using these frameworks to analyze how traditional marriage structures, maybe interact with and reinforce existing racial and gender hierarchies.
So she's not just looking at marriage in a vacuum. She's looking at how it fits into all these other systems.
Exactly. It's not just about one form of inequality. It's about how they all work together.
Okay, so how does this all tie back to her argument about marriage?
Well, her main point, as the YouTuber interprets it, is that this marriage fundamentalism, this belief that the married two-parent family is the best. It automatically gives an advantage to white heteropatriarchal nuclear families. And because it elevates this one specific model, it ends up pushing all other families to the margins. Single-parent households, same-sex couples families formed through adoption or fostering all of them.
So she's saying that even though it's not intentional, this focus on the traditional family structure can actually make things harder for other types of families.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of hidden or unacknowledged structural mechanisms comes in.
That's a mouthful.
Right. And the YouTuber actually pulls that phrase directly from the article. But the argument isn't that every single marriage is like a racist or patriarchal act. It's more about how this societal preference for one particular type of family can unintentionally make it harder for other families to get resources recognition or even just acceptance.
So it's like this underlying system that can perpetuate inequalities without people even realizing it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Professor Letiak's argument. Now let's dive into some of the YouTubers' counterpoints, because it sounds like they had a lot to say.
Oh, yeah. They definitely weren't just taking this lying down.
So what were some of their biggest criticisms?
Well, one of the first things they take issue with is the language that the professors, all that academic jargon.
So they're saying it's too complicated, too hard to understand.
Yeah, they basically accuse her of using all these big words to confuse people rather than making things clear.
Okay, I could see how that would be frustrating.
Yeah, and it kind of feeds into this feeling that academics sometimes use language to hide a weak argument.
So it's like they're saying if you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it.
It's a common critique, and it raises an important point about how to make academic research accessible to a wider audience.
Right, because if you're using all this jargon that only other academics understand, then who are you really talking to?
Exactly.
So besides the language, what else did the YouTuber disagree with?
Well, they also bring up the professor's relationship status again.
Okay, so they're circling back to the fact that she's not married.
Right. And they're basically implying that maybe her views are skewed because...
Got it. So it's like they're saying, well, she's just bitter because she's not married herself.
It's definitely a personal attack rather than engaging with the argument directly.
Yeah. But it's a common tactic when people disagree with something. They try to discredit the person making the argument.
For sure. But in academic discussions, the argument should be able to stand on its own,
Right. It should be based on evidence and logic, not personal attack.
Exactly.
Okay, so what were some of the more substantial counter-arguments that the YouTuber...
Well, one of the big ones is the claim that marriage is not something that white people invented. They argue that it's a concept that's existed across tons of different cultures throughout history, way before colonization.
Interesting.
So this challenges the whole idea that marriage is inherently tied to white supremacy.
Right. If marriage has been around in so many different cultures, then it can't be just a tool of white people.
Exactly. It makes you think about what aspects of marriage are universal and what aspects are culturally specific, Yeah,
that's a good point.
And building on that, the YouTuber even claims that Black families thrived more when marriage was more common in the community.
Oh, wow. So they're directly contradicting the professor's argument.
Right. They're saying that marriage is actually beneficial for Black families.
Yeah. So this is a huge point of disagreement.
Absolutely. It shows how differently people can view the same institution, The YouTuber sees marriage as potentially stabilizing and good, especially for the Black community, while the professor is concerned about the idealized form of marriage being used to maintain white dominance.
So for our listeners, this shows just how complex this issue really is.
Yeah, there's no easy answer here.
Okay, so what else?
Well, the YouTuber also pretty much rejects the whole idea that the two-parent family is a tool of white supremacy.
Okay.
Instead, they present it as just a good model for raising kids.
Right, mom and dad raising a healthy child, that classic image.
Exactly, and that reflects a very traditional view of family.
Yeah, the nuclear family as the ideal.
Right, and that perspective often emphasizes how important both parents are. You know, they each have their own unique role.
Right.
Which is totally different from what the professor is saying.
Yeah, because she's worried about that ideal excluding other types of families.
Right.
So it's two very different ways of looking at the same thing.
For sure.
Okay, so finally, the YouTube commentary mentions that Professor Lydia calls for more research on this topic.
Yeah, she wants other family scientists to investigate how this marriage fundamentalism is contributing to inequality.
And what does the YouTuber think about that?
Well, given how skeptical they are about the whole premise, you can imagine they don't really agree with that call to action.
Right. They probably think it's a waste of time.
Pretty much.
So as we wrap up this discussion, it seems like the central question is marriage this neutral, universally good thing? Or is it something that even unintentionally can reinforce existing power structures and contribute to white supremacy?
Right. And on the other side is the argument that this claim is not only inaccurate, but also potentially harmful.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
It ignores all the good things about marriage and twists history and cultural significance.
A lot to think about.
Definitely, this whole deep dive just shows how a seemingly simple thing like marriage can be so controversial.
Yeah.
One perspective sees it as potentially harmful, especially when it's idealized, while another perspective sees it as a fundamental building block of society across different cultures.
So for our listeners, after hearing all of this, what are some things to consider? What are some of the big takeaways?
Well, it really makes you wonder, you know, what parts of our traditional understanding of marriage need to be re-examined?
Right.
Especially when we're talking about social justice and equality.
Yeah, are there things that we've just always accepted as true about marriage that maybe we need to question?
And how do these different views on a family structure connect to these broader conversations about race and power?
That's a big one.
For sure.
So these are really complex questions with no easy answers.
Yeah. If this has piqued your interest, I'd encourage you to check out the original article.
Yeah.
Or even look into some other research that explores, you know, the connections between family structures and the social inequality.
It's always good to get different perspectives.
Absolutely.
So for anyone who's curious and wants to learn more, we definitely recommend diving into the source material.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best way to learn is to engage with ideas that challenge our assumptions.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Until next time.
See you later.